This very last table ronde. I will present you the people who are going to present very shortly their point of view. And then I think that we all hope that the discussion will be open around the table and also with the people in the room. So Ruth West is an international recognized artist who has been working with computer art for the last 25 years. She was one of the two graduated people from the University of Massachusetts with a Master of Fine Arts degree in computer graphic. She works with digital collage, flash interactivity, and web design. She teaches at the University of North Texas. Roger MALINA will talk, be the second to talk, is well known of all of us. Executive editor of Leonardo Publications at MIT Press, and distinguished professor of arts and technology and professor of physics at the University of Texas at Dallas. He is also a directeur de recherche of the CNRS at the Laboratoire d'Astrophysique de Marseille. His specialty in astrophysics is space instrumentation. His current work focuses on connections between science and art. Sara is the president of OCAD University in Toronto, well-known and specialized university in art and design. Sara is works on data visualization, wearable technology, and mobile media research. She's an artist, a designer, and a scientist. A decade ago, she developed CodeZebra.net, a social media software and performance and responsive fashion environment. And François-Joseph LAPOINTE is a professor at the University of Montreal in the Department of Biological Sciences. And he had the fantasy or the courage to make a second PhD in the studies and practices in art. He worked intensively on performance art and microbiome research. So I think that they will talk, each of them, for, let's say, 2-3 minutes. And then they will, Ruth will ask 3 questions, which are going to be the main topics of the discussion this morning. So I'll let you go.
Okay, sure, thanks. So I think I should talk a bit about why I'm on this panel, which is clearly, I lead a university environment that's developed a very strong research capacity in art and technology and digital media, art design and health, and the more sort of classical art history and curatorial capacities. Within that process, there's been a growing relationship with science curriculum and engineering curriculum. And so one of the things I know that we're going to talk about is the ways that the understanding of art and science practices have transformed within the current contemporary environment. In 2009, I participated in a book that was entitled Rethinking the Contemporary Art School, the Artist, the PhD, and the Academy. And within that, I argued, and I'll quote myself, the argument in these pages is to move the current accelerating collaborative practices of artists, scientists, engineers, and designers away from the margins and into the center of at least a part of the practice of art and design teaching and research institutions. And I argued for the value of hybridized knowledge, yet recognized that working across deep disciplinary capability was equally valuable. Many of you would know that I founded the Banff New Media Institute, which built on the fantastic work of Michael Century in virtual reality research, and it became a kind of discursive center, bringing together artists, scientists, designers, and engineers to imagine the future and to network projects that also had a kind of collaborative infrastructure for visualization and wearables. But it really was a center for collaboration, and in fact, we were funded by Social Science, Humanities and Research Council in Canada to create the Banff International Collaboration Studies Network, which was overlaced with a big engineering network in Canada, but it looked at the ethnography of collaboration, which I think is really interesting. So I hope to come back to how collaboration has been theorized, and it also had a big focus on collaborative technologies. And then on just a more personal note, building on Louise's overview of my biography, in 2003, I locked up artists and scientists together for 24 hours, which kind of reenacted Latour and Woolgar's laboratory life, but in a 24-hour fast-tracked reality television context. And it actually, there were a lot of things that came out of that process about the importance of co-location that I think we should, you know, kind of touch on. And then finally, I am a university president. I've managed to, because I don't sleep a lot, protect my research activities. And I'm currently co-PI in a multi-million-dollar network in visualization, theme leader of a project on transit visualization and planning. I'm on the executive of the Brain Institute, a newly funded big data network. All of these research activities are fundamentally collaborative. So they are art, science, design, engineering projects. And I'd like to talk, I know we're going to talk about how in the context of big science and networks, you know, where is art practice and the kind of theoretical work that we do compromised? And you know, and where does it actually, how does it manage to make a kind of contribution? I continue to write on media art history, so I have some legitimacy at this conference, as well as being one of the founding members with Roger and Oliver back in 2005 of the event.
I'm next. Thank you for this nice introduction. I guess I'm going to play devil's advocate here and be the ugly duckling or the black sheep of the family, because it's kind of paradoxical that I'm sitting on a panel on transdisciplinary collaboration in media, art, sciences, and technology, because I don't believe in art-science collaboration, because everything I see around me is art-science exploitation. I'm trying to be provocative here for the sake of the discussion. I don't believe in transdisciplinarity either, as a collaborative bilateral process, because all I see is a one-way street. So I'm going to try to propose today an alternative model, one that is not based on collaboration between groups of people working together on a similar object or similar project, but I'm going to advocate paradisciplinarity, which is a term that I coined to define the work of a single individual practicing art and science at the same time. An individual with speaking two languages and being able to serve as a translator, mediator, interpreter, or intercessor between these two different cultures. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this later on. So this is what Roger Malina has defined as type 4 individuals in your classification of art-science collaboration, which is individuals with dual careers as working scientists and exhibiting artists at the same time.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here. I'm Ruth West. I'm currently at the University of North Texas, and I began my academic career actually as a molecular geneticist, then went on to get a degree in clinical psychology and actually saw patients, and then fulfilled a lifelong dream of getting an MFA, and I got in design and new media, and I somehow am now walking the journey to try and combine all of this. So I started my journey about a little over 10 years ago with the following questions. If there is an art science, well, what does it look like? How do I go about it? And most importantly, what does it make possible that you otherwise can't do? And then my personal question was, can the arts actually nurture scientific discovery? And I did that initial work within the context of a new media degree. And then now, continuing on, my questions have evolved to things like thinking about how do you look for what you don't know you're looking for? And then trying to evolve hybrid forms of both practice and experience. And I currently articulate my outcomes of this work as new types of art forms, different types of insight or knowledge, levels of public engagement, technology R&D, new kinds of educational experiences and competencies, and also importantly is partnerships, industry, academic, community partnerships. About 2 years ago, I moved to University of North Texas and established an art science research lab. And I currently have about 15 students, both grad and undergrad, working. They encompass the disciplines of journalism, anthropology, psychology, music, new media arts, photography, computer science and engineering, geospatial analysis, political science, sculpture, history, and information sciences. And they cover everything from freshmen up to doctoral students, and one of them that has completed a PhD. This past Wednesday, we had the first conversation at our university to bridge the arts and sciences. We called it a cross-resonance dialogues. And we just sent out this invitation, a very small invitation, because we thought maybe nobody would come. We were a little bit concerned. Just kind of student word of mouth, saying, okay, well, you know, it's possible that a journalist can learn from a chemist and, you know, a computer scientist from an artist or whatnot. And 40 people showed up. And of those, there were 2 faculty, myself and another faculty member, and the rest were students. And they represented everything from chemistry to mathematics. And they drew a diagram that represented their interests and their home disciplines and the interconnections. And we discussed that. One of the things that I found most fascinating that might be something we can push on here is that one of the artists said, well, what I do is I identify new knowledge, incremental increase in knowledge through observation. And so then the chemists, there was a group of forensic chemistry students that, well, that's what we do too. And so then they started this conversation about, well, if we do the same thing in practice, you know, if I'm drawing and I'm actually gaining knowledge through observation, then what is this difference? And I think that when we get to notions of validity, we can talk there. But my question is, you know, how do we go beyond that, if that is where things are? So I also think that some of the outcomes that we've had with our students are really interesting to me, but also I wish to go beyond them. So if they feel that, in their words, they feel the world is an interdisciplinary world, but then if they can't actually get credit for a class with me, then I'm not sure how to help them get to that interdisciplinary world. So that's part of why I'm here today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. François-Joseph, I misunderstood you. Did you say paterdisciplinarity or paradisciplinarity? Maybe pata is better. Anyway, so just wanted to contextualize. I just changed careers. I retired. I'm now a retired French civil servant. I get a French pension, actually. So I'm no longer a practicing astrophysicist. I retired last July. And I'm now a full-time earth science researcher at the University of Texas at Dallas. And I'm both a professor of physics and a professor of art and technology. I have PhD students in arts and humanities, in art and technology, in computer science, and in physics. So I'm trying to figure out how we do this. And I just wanted to mention 3 things I read this year that have got me thinking. One is a book by Randall Collins called The Sociology of Philosophy. And he studied the evolution of schools of philosophy over the last 2,000–3,000 years in China, in India, in Europe. And what's very interesting, and I think we as a community need to study ourselves better because there are sociological processes that we need to understand to actually help our own community to evolve into the future. So the second thing I read was by Edward Said, who you all know, who has a book on the late style, and particularly looking at how the creative activities of young people and older people differ. And what's very interesting to me at the moment is I'm in touch with people in our community that are 80 years old and 90 years old. We just did a Skype recording with Ken Snelson, who worked on tensegrity sculptures and so on. But I'm also working with 17-year-olds working on games in the Oculus Rift. And so I think it's really interesting in our community of practice now of how we've become very intergenerational, and we don't actually know how to put that into the way we do things. And finally, the last thing I just wanted to mention, the other thing that I read this summer was a report called Improving the Effectiveness of Science Teams. It's published by a community of practice working on the science of science teams, which actually comes mostly out of the medical research area, where interdisciplinary collaboration is a huge, difficult problem. And they've been developing methodologies that I think we can use in our community of practice, also in transdisciplinary collaboration. Thank you.
Before I pose the 3 questions, I'm just curious, show of hands, how many of you here consider yourself a scientist?
Natural or social or humanities?
Any type of scientist. Right on. Okay, how many of you consider yourself an artist? How many of you consider yourself something in between? Okay, interesting. All right, well, we hope you're going to join us in a lively conversation here. After much thought and deliberation amongst us, we've decided to pose 3 questions. So this notion, concept, topic, and practice of research creation, is it actually unifying or is it tearing things apart? The next, why go solo versus collaborate? And lastly, where's the validity in hybrid objects and practices? So I'm going to open it up to my colleagues for conversation and discussion around all 3 of these topics. Go.
Seeing as how we're being, for us, excruciatingly silent, maybe sort of to jump in. So, and I think, you know, it's sort of interesting because I think the second question and the first one have a lot of proximity. But the idea of research creation is both wonderful and problematic. And the problematic is its sort of institutionalization. You know, it came in part, or I would say in part also the PhD structure or infrastructure and the push for that. It came in part from pressures within the academy to find kind of parallel language to the ways that science is evaluated, the need within, you know, the very pressured European and Australian and British you know, research evaluation exercise to ensure that faculty within the arts disciplines were contributing, you know, to the overall bottom line of their university. So without a question, that's a dynamic, and you can look at the data and you can see that. But it also came from another set of directions, which are the ones that I prefer to celebrate. And, you know, the recognition on the part of some artists designers, digital media makers, that they had developed methodologies that they could articulate, that we could articulate, some of which were embodied, some of which could be placed into kind of parallel language or metaphor, that were really useful to share and to build upon, and that actually should circulate as forms of knowledge. And that also there were kinds of practices which were less about creating finished product, i.e. what you do in an MFA type environment or as an artist within certain kinds of contexts, and more were about continual sets of investigations that were legitimate. So research creation became a way of formalizing, creating a language around a set of kind of discursive objects, to look at a wide range of research practices. I was one of the people in Canada involved with Social Science and Humanities Research Council in trying to set up those parameters very early on. And I think they continue to be extremely useful. I think it's extremely useful to kind of interrogate, rip apart, and look at that category. Objectively, it has resulted in significant funding, both from the Quebec Research Agency, that's Louise now fantastically is heading, and also within the Canadian context. And the kinds of looking at how one evaluates research outputs on the part of artist-driven researchers, whether they come from the sciences or from the arts, I think is incredibly important, because it's looked at much more impacts, societal impacts, kinds of outputs, I think, that, kind of critiques that I think we're very interested in as a larger community. So in that sense, I think it's a very useful category. The one that needs interrogation constantly. And at some point, I want to come back to the idea of the laboratory, which was a great debate yesterday morning on one of the panels. And I know Michael Century has also contributed to this event in our conversation today, and the use of that term and what it means. And I think that's probably in category 3.
I'm going to jump in just to answer the last question. How do we evaluate these hybrid objects? Because this is my fantasy. As a hybrid researcher, I'm trying to work on things that could be science projects and art object at the same time. And this was in my seed, the white paper entitled How to Become an Art Scientist. And there were some guidelines that were recommended to the stakeholders, and one was to define new metrics of success, because it's fairly easy for scientists we know the metrics of success, how many papers you have, how many papers in Nature you have, or in science, and as an artist, how many exhibitions you have. So for me, if the same object can produce a scientific paper and be in a gallery, that would be like the culmination of what art science is. But we need new metrics to define that, not just add up the two.
Well, in having attempted to at least articulate that in some way, shape, or form myself, I think one of the challenges is that it takes time, and it actually takes more time to do that kind of work and to find objects that have that kind of on-the-edge validity. So we've had some small amount of success in actually developing work that has scientific utility, while at the same, and it can be published in a scientific journal, while at the same time it has exhibited publicly in art venues. But I have to admit that it's been very hard won, and it's hard to articulate the value until the work has been realized, and while you're working on it, it's not always clear. So I think that that's actually a way in which tensions arise from the research creation process that I've observed.
Okay, so I just want to, I guess, rebound on Sara. So the research creation thing, I think also we need to think about whether universities are part of the problem or part of the solution. And we tend to think in those kind of terms when, in fact, I think what's of interest is the communities of practice and then the communities of place that go with those activities. And I think one of the things that's so difficult for us is that universities want norms and standards, but we're dealing with heterogeneous practices that in their very nature have different finalities, different success criteria. And so how we navigate the pressure from the universities, which are really ghettos with their own value system, and what we think is create a transformative practice that maybe change the way we live, the communities we live in, and so on. I think that conflict is a really deep one, so I'm not sure one criteria, François-Joseph, is what we're looking for. I think we're dealing with a multiplicity of heterogeneous practices, and that's part of, I think, what we're bringing to the table.
So I want to build on this because I don't think we're disagreeing, Roger. I mean, if anything, I kind of prefaced it by some of the problems with the institutional lens. But I do think this space is a really valuable space because it allows a set of practices that are about process, about systems, and not only about the final outcome to actually really enter the space of creative research. And this is a far broader category than art and science collaboration or cross-disciplinary collaboration. I think the debate that happens within the art school context, and this is very acute right now in the U.S., is this legitimate artwork? Is it legitimate design work? Is this diluting the quality of the kind of product that's entering the kind of finished creative space of art and design? And some strong feelings about practitioners who enter from the science context into art making and whose aesthetics come from a different space. I think this is fantastic. I mean, I just think in the 21st century, these are the kinds of dialogues we need to be having. And one of the things I did to prepare for this panel is I looked at, from the Banff days looking forward, what were the big kind of, what theory was informing our community. And I think the richness of the sort of theoretical conversations that are now happening within the art and science community, within the media art histories community, the leap forward from the Frankfurt School, kind of versus Rorty-type pragmatism, which is sort of where we were 15, 20 years ago, to the kind of complexity of discourse is phenomenal. And I really think that the research creation context has been a very important, very integrated piece to that conceptual work that's been happening.
Yeah, simultaneously though, what I think, even though I know I've been part of these large scientific consortia, mostly in biomedicine, there is a lot of challenge around collaboration and how it scales up or down. But in the sciences, you have the scientific method and you have some agreed upon manner of defining the problem and what you're going after. And so the validity of that object is not just because everyone knows it's about a publication or new knowledge or knowledge that's useful to someone else, but you have some method for shared definition of the problem. And in art science, I think, at least from my just on the ground perspective, it's not always clear. Like, how do you define what you're actually construing as what you're addressing? And it takes a lot of work within a team to develop that.
One of the challenges for me is, and Louise, on your opening remark, on the first day of the conference, you were mentioning the issue of authorship. So if you have like 5 different scientists working together on a paper, they're all going to be co-authors on this paper, and the senior author is going to be the last one, and the junior author is going to be the first one, and all the others are going to be like the sandwich authors. But if you have a bunch of artists working together with a scientist, who's going to be the author of the artwork? And you were mentioning contributorship. I think this is a big challenge when you have scientists working with artists. Sometimes they're merely technicians. So this is like the artists exploiting the scientists, but the other way around is also true. Sometimes the artists among scientists are just the graphic designers. Oh, you're going to be good with the visualization tools. And so this is, for me, the big challenge, and that's why it took me 20 years to become an art scientist. And I don't claim that everybody should do 2 PhDs. I don't know if it's better to do science first and then art, or art first and then science, or train young kids with art and science at once. But it's a very difficult and long process.
I just want to challenge you, Ruth, on the scientific method. Let me reassure you that the scientific method is just as confused as the artistic method. And let me tell you, Galileo did not do the same science in the same way than the Nobel Prize winners today. And so the validation of knowledge in science actually has evolved dramatically over the centuries. I think right now we're living in this sort of very short-lived period after the Second World War, which defined a certain kind of science, and that we're really changing that. And one of the people that's written a lot about this is Helga Novotny, about socially robust science and rethinking the societal embedding of science. And so I know you didn't really mean it that way when you said it, but we do tend to fall into this duality, which I think is misleading, that there's a scientific method that's established and stable, when in fact it's an evolving method. And at a given time, different scientists actually work in different ways to validate their knowledge.
When I was working on the Code Zebra project, I mean, one of the things that I did was to interview quite a few scientists and mathematicians about their method, and to sort of make them uncomfortable in those interviews, and or maybe overly comfortable, I don't know. But they kind of confessed that a lot of what happens is reverse engineering in terms of publication. So there's all these publication norms, and they have a method, and there's a whole sets of breaches within that which are about creativity. It's about how discovery happens. It's points of realization. Some of them are very embodied. One of Canada's top mathematicians makes these little stupid, in his words, sculptural things and closes his eyes and plays with them, and at some point an algorithm emerges. I mean, people told me these stories about their methodologies, which have these moments. What is different is repetition. So what's different is you realize something and then you have to repeat it because science requires that. And I think in a lot of the work that artists do, we don't acknowledge that we also repeat, that we also iterate. And so there's levels that are parallel there. So I want to reinforce Roger's point, and I think one of the reasons for collaboration is for disruption. There's a value in collaboration because it disrupts both our accepted norms that we think are the ways that we work, ideas about intuition, etc. And it also disrupts the ways that different kinds of science works. And again, I think, the work of people like Anne-Marie Cacolin, she's a French theorist who kind of works on Bordeaux's notions, actor network theory. These bodies of theory are really important because they force us to open the black box of methodology and how we create things, and it pushes that into science too. And I think the hardest fights that happen in art-science collaboration are around defining methodology, around understanding language, boundary objects, and we should be working together because those are useful fights for society, and they're also about defining outcomes. We have to make our way through those, but I think the problems you encounter are all the reasons why this collaboration is actually useful.
I think we can receive some questions from the attendants, if you have any, but we can continue also.
There.
There's some microphones.
Please take the mic.
Come on up.
Just use the microphone. Stand up and have a mic.
So Tell us your name, please.
Okay, hi. Thanks a lot for all the inputs. Just hearing you, I was wondering, or I missed some more profound discussion on historical and sociological conditions of research, science, and art in general. We just, I have the feeling that the discussion is centered around existential, phenomenological, individual accounts of how one arranges the situation of being in several fields, although it might be interesting to just put it in a larger historical context, and maybe why not at a conference like this just really think together of what does it mean. I mean, is historically speaking, Forscher, savant, scientist is not exactly the same thing, but has been practiced in a similar manner in the 19th century, and economic conditions and research funding are determinant in history of how art work has been created and science has been done. And we never speak about why we discuss art and science, because it's not exactly the same way you would discuss it in Europe as you would discuss it in America or in Canada. It is related to the education system and the way we can switch from one discipline to the other. And so I sometimes miss a little bit a comparative and historical discussion about this really practice, what we do. So, and is an intellectual a scientist or a researcher? I mean, you can go really broad, but I think it will be interesting to really focus historically on the practice seen politically, economically, and also reflect today why we are here and how we are funded, and why do we put emphasis on these questions rather than others, and should we not shift the discussion to a more urgent question? So sorry if this was a bit confused, but I just feel like also like I am into the history and art education, and I'm just also sometimes a bit just annoyed by this recurrent labeling of research-based art and etc. And in the art school, for example, in Switzerland, we push the artists to do research, but without really giving them a broader framework of why they should do that, and also accompany them in their careers. Because actually, why they should do it is because of the funding possibilities that arise recently, but also because it's very difficult for artists these days, let's say the last decade, to be commercially successful. So it pushes a bit those who might not be commercially successful into research, but without really understanding this shift and without really having a purpose. And so if we don't contextualize and historicize the research funding, politics, and the epistemological distinctions between all these practitioners, I think it's kind of a closed circuit.
I think you give us a suggestion that maybe another conference should be on that specific topic. And with a lot of...
Well, I just want to respond because I actually thought we were doing some of that. So, but maybe in a non-sort of giving papers kind of way. And I know in the Canadian context, it is very interesting to look back at, and Michael Century, and I didn't hear his talk, but Michael's done a phenomenal amount of work in looking at the evolution of the sort of creative laboratory and the sorts of institutional pressures to create those kinds of formations. But part of that has come, and it's important to underscore that, there has been a drive, and it's a post-war drive, through artists' curiosity in approaching science. And, some of it has been because they wanted tools, Some of it has been validation, but some of it has come from wanting to answer questions that they felt they could not do alone. And that in Canada, that push started in the late 50s, very much the National Film Board, University of Toronto was part of that formation. I'm not going to go through the whole history, but it is a very interesting evolution to look at a set of activities that were informal, found homes and institutions, and then have moved into the academy, a lot because of the kind of funding challenges that the speaker just described. So yeah, it would be a very good, I mean, there have been conferences that look at this, but I think it's a time to go back at it, in part because, and I hope we get to this, the model is shifting. The model is becoming much more the model of François-Joseph, which is that we are now pushing knowledges towards our students in the art and design context, which will make them into hybrid practitioners. Right. But I don't think that works in all areas of needed collaboration or disciplinary capacity.
I'd like to suggest Roger Malina, to talk about the radical digital, because we talk about digital art all the week, and nobody talk about the radical digital, because you talked about digital radical. You talk about this in Brazil for a conference, the challenges and when we work with the digital, but in the field of health, education, etc. Because your proposal in Brazil make me take a program in education for engineers and new Leonardos in this way, for working in the transdisciplinary way in the University of Brasilia, in the new Leonardos, in the campus of engineering, and work with my students from arts, and we did excellent projects and theses, and after we got the project at MIT in the field of new Leonardos and the digital radical. You know, you talked about this.
I guess I want to pick up first and maybe tie it to your question. So
the radical digital.
I think the question of the societal and economic embedding of the discussion is really important. And I guess, you know, we all need to do psychoanalysis, but I guess I think we're in a world that in fact is not sustainable, right? I mean, I think we probably will say that at some level. And so for me, art-science collaboration is not a nice thing to do, but it's an urgent thing to do. And a phrase that I picked up in Texas, of all places, and I don't really like the phrase, but it makes the point, of the hard humanities. So we often think of the arts and humanities as kind of things on the periphery of the problem solving, of how we're going to navigate the next century. I mean, we have the climate change conference coming up in Paris in a few weeks, and it's like virtual reality. You know, I mean, everybody's, you know, dealing with. I mean, I don't know what's going on. So I think that looking at the social and economic embedding of this question over the last 2-3 centuries is important. And then that asks the question is, why must artists and scientists work together right now to help, you know, rethink how we actually live day to day? And I apologize for my carbon footprint, because I just went from Dallas to California to Montreal to Dallas in 1 week. And so that probably was not the right way to live.
I agree with that, and also I purposefully did not bring up my own discomfort with the research creation topic, because I have benefited from the work of Roger and Sara and laying the groundwork for me to be able to step into something like this. But I also believe, and part of what the student dialogue was on Wednesday was, you know, it's quote unquote not a one solution world anymore. And so, and also I think the young people that I'm interacting with at my university, they want to create a world that is somehow more just or has solutions. They're very anxious about their future, and they don't just see themselves as, okay, I'm just going to be an engineer or a forensic chemist or whatever. And so where's the path for that? So I think that there's these multiple layers. It's not just the history. It's like there is a tremendous opportunity. There's groundwork that's been laid. At the same time, we're all kind of walking, talking experiments here. I mean, Roger's program, my small lab, even my appointment. I'm cross-appointed in 4 colleges in 4 different disciplines. So it's still very much in the making. At least that's the way I see it.
Since the beginning of modernity, we drift our model of thinking from introspection to intersubjectivity. I would say, maybe I should say the cliche of thinking. And at the beginning, introspection proposed something like the doubt, like a problem. But Descartes told us that it's not a problem, it's a fruitful phenomena. So now can we shift from doubt to conflict? Because we are in the intersubjectivity model, can we see conflicts as a fruitful and fruitful things to produce and start to think together, as we did with doubt, who was a negative notion for religion. But now conflict would be the challenge for scientific, producing new conflicts to produce new knowledge.
Yes, conflict is very fruitful. It is the only way I work. I'm always a conflicting individual and conflicted individual, but it's also sometimes quite depressing. I'm sorry for getting back to my own story again, so I'll try to answer your question by going back to 1865, because I was trying to find the link between what I do as a scientist and what I do as an artist. And for me, the commonality, there are many, many differences, but the commonality is experimentation. You were talking that we're all making experiments, and so I went back to the actual definition of experimental science by Claude Bernard in 1865, and it's experimentation is it defined it as the art of obtaining rigorous and well-defined experiment. Claude Bernard defined experimentation as the art of rigorous and well-defined experiments. And then if you go to 1993 and you read Alan Capro's definition of experimental art, it is the verification or testing of a principle. So what I'm claiming here today is that these two definitions can be swapped quite easily, and maybe experimentation is the antidote to the classical art-science dualism. In fact, this is what I claim in my paper for Media N, that experimentation is probably the common ground between what I do as an artist and what I do as a scientist. So there are many differences, but there are some common grounds.
I think the conversation around intersubjectivity as a model is really very interesting. And when in work I was doing where I was studying collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration, it was I looked at long-term collaborations and the ways that both self-definition and subjectivities began to merge. And the ways that people took on new identities through the process of needing to work out their boundary objects, so their languages that they used, methodologies, outcomes. This is a time-based process that's interesting. The other thing that I found really interesting is to look at the kinds of pressures within the social sciences, at least in the sort of post-structuralist era, to self-declare positionality and to try and understand what that method means in terms of scientific research, where there's still, despite the kind of multiplicity of methods, still very much an attachment to notions of objectivity. So when an ethnographer, a social scientist, approaches a problem now, they will say, this is how I define myself, this is the methodology I'm using, know I have these limits to my knowledge. You know, often they'll create an identity position from which they're doing the research now. I mean, the debate we had yesterday about, you know, doing work on the Inuit and, you know, who has to be at the table, for example. And that is not a tendency within science or mathematics. So, I mean, I think that's a very interesting part of the kind of intersubjectivity discussion is, you know, how does one work with data? How does one work with putting together a set of shared objectives when one set of players, and artists, I think, tend to also declare positionality, feel the need to declare that as part of what's now normative in their professions. I hope I'm being clear with this. And others would say if I position myself, it means that the research is not objective. So, I mean, I think that's interesting in terms of the problem of intersubjectivity. And then I think there's a set of methodologies, participatory research, action research, et cetera, which fits what Roger's call to action is, which is that you say, you know, we're engaging in this problem because we think we have a higher objective here that we need to work on together. And so we're going to use a set of collaborative methodologies which, you know, have been tested to some extent to try and, you know, reach agreement, redefine problems, et cetera. So I hope there's some, again, I want to go back to the person who kind of challenged us to be more, maybe a bit more rigorous and say, you know, here are some of the challenges that we have in working together that are historicized, that come from methods that tend to be disciplinarily defined.
Roger, can you say anything about the history of the funding?
I think there are 5 more people who want to talk. Maybe, can I ask you to have short questions and maybe short answers? Michael, and you, and Michael.
Thank you. On the question of the role of art and the role of science, especially in the current times, to me it's difficult to say something about the role of art, but maybe I got a lot of questions about the role of science, in particular because of its hegemonic presence at this time in building reality. So I think that science is no more an access to nature, but depends on the question of the scientist and the sociology of funding and the program that the institution have. So I believe that, especially in these times, it's very important the why, the how, and what's going to happen on when you are researching. So my question is that if the artists are the ones that are called to play that role, if they get on in science seriously, I mean, using the scientific method and all that, to play that role in adding those additional conditions in terms of ethics, the why, the how. That's my question.
I don't think that's a question. I think that's a statement, and it's a valid one.
No, my question is if art, the area, the disciplinary that is called to play that role. Mm-hmm. Why? Why art? Maybe it could be philosophy, I don't know. Or maybe the same science milieu that have to, I don't know, maybe more critic. That's my question.
Well, there's a lot of philosophers now working with science and doing science, and I think that's kind of an interesting new paradigm. And you know, personally, I believe in multidisciplinary engagement here, and the role of sort of critical ethnography, for example, within putting together a project, a research project, ethicists. You know, I don't think it's just on the shoulders of the artist to have to call the social questions and issues within those kinds of collaborations. But I think there's a place for artists to be at the table, at the beginning, not as illustrators.
Michael?
I have a quick pragmatic point to make, and then I want to pick up some of the openings that I felt Sara was making to revisit the laboratory in a couple of these points. So the quick pragmatic point is, as an advisor in a program that has doctoral students in art practice, actually doctoral students in integrated electronic art practice, I wonder how many of us actually feel there's a little dirty secret to share. And my dirty little secret to share is, for every student who really does have a research question, there are many more who play a certain justificatory game by formulating their artistic work in terms of hypotheses and research questions, just so long as you get the grant, just so long as the doctoral funding is guaranteed. And that's my dirty little secret. There are many more of the latter than the former. And that's just pragmatic. That's just what I experience. As far as the intergenerational question, Roger, the late style and intergenerational, what I was trying to do on my talk on the first day was think about some of the ways the late 90s are different from now. And one of the ways the late 90s are different from now is that I certainly, spent a lot of time making arguments for art, science, engineering, collaboration, interdisciplinarity, and so forth, on the logic of innovation, that there are innovation outcomes that are valuable. And back then, there was a lot of talk about creativity and content creation and benefits to the economy and all those things we were arguing for. And beyond productivity at the National Academy of Sciences followed that, arguing for those sorts of general goods. Now, today is very different. The information technology paradigm is mature. We're saturated. What are the next steps to think about? And I'll reprise that what I said on Thursday is that the art-science nexus has the promise to provide an extremely clear and legible innovation logic to the policy people and to the funders and so forth. And it has to do with real, not questions of creative industries and content creation or any of that. It has to do with food and energy and health and all of those art-science connections which have to do with things that are after the information technology paradigm, that have to do with rising, let's call it social goods, that are not just about economy, but they're about many other things. So that's what I was trying to say about that on Thursday. Final point for our international visitors. I was reading the so-called National English newspaper, and the young new Minister of Culture, who's actually called the Minister of Canadian Heritage, was interviewed saying, "I see the importance of culture and content creation in a holistic way. I want to make sure the impact of innovation in the arts is part of the process of decision-making in cabinet and the different ministries." This is Mélanie Joly. Innovation in the arts, part of decision-making at cabinet level. What do we want her to understand? That's my thought. And I think that we may want her to understand things that are a little more advanced than the way we're talking about this stuff in the 90s.
But in fact, Michael, that 1990s discourse is still very, very prevalent. So, right,
It totally is. So I think we have to move beyond it.
That's right, and I think that's so. And the way I normally put it, there's this kind of pipeline: earth science, creativity, innovation, entrepreneurs, jobs, full employment. Well, what we really need is the economists and the philosophers and the sociologists to embed that in the larger question: what kinds of jobs, what kind of communities. What kind of society? And in fact, the funding agencies are very badly placed to ask those questions. They're not mandated to ask those questions. And so I think how we raise that meta discussion, the intersubjectivity that just came up, is really is a burning issue. And I don't think, are there any economists in the room? No. So, what kind of a world do we want to live in, and what kind of jobs do we want this innovation to lead to?
Yes, maybe I take the question there.
Hi. I had a question about whether or not how evaluation and funding and the disciplines themselves might be kind of bringing some kind of anxiety, and I'll just explain from my own point of view. I just did a very large, well, not a very large, but I just did an exhibition at Concordia, and it was a collaborative project that I did with a graduate student in biology, and we purposely avoided connecting it directly to our studies, and doors opened for us because we didn't ask for money, but people gave us favors from the university all over the place because we didn't ask for anything. And what was really interesting is we inhabited our exhibition for 6 weeks, and the most enthusiasm that we got was from people who weren't from science or from fine arts. They were people just walking through the building. And so it felt as though what we did was completely acceptable or appreciated or embraced by people who were from neither fine arts or from science, like people going commuters, people, librarians, people, staff members. They all came to talk to us and tell us how excited they were and asked us questions, but mostly artists came to visit me because they felt sorry for me because I was sitting in behind glass for 6 weeks.
Can I encourage you to ask for everything? Don't ask for anything, ask for everything. And this is what I do. So I have grants from NSERC, I have grants from SHRC, I have grants from FRQSC, I have grants from FRQNT. So if you work together with scientists and artists, then you can ask for everything. So don't set yourself low. Aim for the sky.
Just a quick one. In terms of this collaboration, I might be coming back to a previous part of the conversation, but I like very much your hard humanities definition, Roger. But I want to share my dirty little secrets or my personal recipe on the collaboration. I mean, conflict, as Deleuze says, is a dimension of existence, so we cannot live without conflicts. But I think that there are other ways that are, I mean, if you like conflicts, knock yourself off. It's no problem. But there are other ways of collaborating or sharing that are based, and I give you my recipe, it's a personal recipe. I can always come back to Hegel that says there are no datas, only elaborations, like volts, watts, kilos, whatever. It's an elaborate, it's a régime de discours. I don't know how to say this in English, sorry. So this régime de discours is also parallel to another one that has the same validity, which means if you leak a battery, electricity has also a taste. So, and there are, since Wittgenstein, we know that there are no discourses that are superior to another discourse because they're all games of languages. Okay, if they're all games of languages and have same value, because no one can say my game of languages is superior to yours, that's Jean comes back. This means that nowadays objectivity is just intersubjectivity of groups of people that share the same games of language. So let's knock ourselves off playing with our processus de véridiction and games of languages, because there are no games superior to the other. Even the Nobel Prize, Luca and Luigi Cavalli-Sforza in '94, for the history and geography of human genes, say whatever we discovered, maybe in 5 years, is nothing. So let's play again around this, and to end, I come back to Deleuze that says that we are. All of us, we are creators. Somehow, philosophy creates concepts, art creates percept, I don't know how to say this in English, and science creates functions. So it's a nice weaving of this. I mean, we can do it, of course, with conflict, and there will probably be moments of conflict. But if we think that we have this parallel regime of discourse, we can trespass them and produce something fruitful, hopefully.
Well, first of all, you have to be aware that these parallel discourse regime exists. And so the issue of language is very important in what I do, because Esperanto was a failed experiment. And so let's not try to find a common language between art and science. What I'm claiming is that we need to know and be aware and master all these different languages and regime de discours. And once we know and acknowledge that there are different regimes, different discourses, and we know and master them, then we can collaborate together. If we try to hierarchize these different regimes with respect to one another, then we run back to conflict again.
And there's, I think, another layer, maybe to add to this, kind of coming back to the positionality discussion. There's a really great text by Anne-Marie Moll, which she wrote in 1998, and I think it still bears great relevance. It's called Ontological Practices, and it talks about research as a set of as performance. So, this is sort of during the performative turn. And I think it's a useful way, again, to come back to it's not only about discourse and how they play, but also about roles and, understanding doxa and habituus and the way that we're positioned as scientists, as artists, and to constantly interrogate whether those are givens or in fact can be rewritten in the performance of doing research together in different kinds of ways. And I want to make sure we come back to, I think, a problematic that Michael underscored, which is that a lot of this collaborative work it's instrumental work. It's seen as art being instrumental in some ways. And I think practitioners of art within other sorts of spaces would argue very hard against the kind of the utility, the kind of teleological positioning of what the outcomes need to be. So we perhaps need to return to that.
So I totally buy into the question of how we juggle these multiple discourses, which at any given time they may be hierarchized differently. And the problem then, of course, is defining the fruitful outcomes, right? That's the difficult part of the problem. I'm always very uncomfortable with Brockman's thing about the third culture and that we're all going to kind of merge into some common discourse. But the difficult part then is how we define those fruitful outcomes, drawing on the multiple discourses. And that's where I think the collaboration problem is really difficult, because it's kind of easy to do things together that don't have fruitful outcomes.
Two last questions.
A couple of points, I'm afraid, rather. I mean, I want to make three brief points. One is about the de-idealization and the sort of denormative of scientific method itself, which we came to earlier. And just wanted to remind us all that the historians of science are doing a lot of important work for us here. Hans-Jörg Reinberger's work is perhaps exemplary, I think, in giving a very different account. It's not just language games or discursive. In fact, the very point of his work is that this incredibly interesting movement between the kind of reification of thought in an experimental system and the way that, so a sort of a-human, not non or post, but a-humanist kind of model of the interaction of sort of embodied thought in the technology and the scientists, this iterative process. Reinberger goes a long way to only beginning, it seems to me, to pluralize our understanding of scientific method. Second brief point about the UK. In my paper at the beginning, I gave a bit of a history of science policy in the UK and why a certain quite instrumental, picking up Sara's her point just now, a certain instrumental understanding of art science arose under the paradigm of public understanding of science and so on, and even science communication. But that, this is being sort of eaten away at, quite rightly, by other organizations and bodies. But on the UK, because I think this is often misunderstood, I would say that our attitude should be, I'm going to call it a proper ambivalence. That is to say, the regime of research assessment and increased funding that we've had for 30 years now has been both highly productive and, of course, has produced a lot of very redundant and, kind of instrumentally engendered work. But that real ambivalence we need to hold on to, because there have been some extraordinary outcomes. For example, much higher sources of funding and resources for the arts and humanities than ever existed before. And that's only magnified by the impact of the European Research Council, which I also mentioned briefly, which is, grants of 2.5 million euros to artists and humanists, which is a scale of funding you don't have in the US. And, it's quite an extraordinary experiment in funding. Last point, I would just love to pick up the very important point made earlier about historicizing and sociologies of all this. I am someone who does a sociology or anthropology of these developments, and there's one aspect we haven't touched on, as far as I'm aware, much at all in the conference, and it's about audiences, okay? And I just want to give a thumb-sized sketch of something I'm working with. I wish you'd all send me emails and tell me I'm wrong. But it seems to me something we don't talk about much is the massification, that's the word I like to use, the massification of the populations of young people going into the arts, humanities, and music these days, for a couple of decades probably. And what that seems to, that has happened in parallel with the transformations we're talking about. In Bourdieu's terms, what we have increasingly is audiences that consist of our peers, all of us, our audiences for each other. And the festivals, conferences like this, the biennales, the explosion in this circuit is how we all consume each other's work and engage in these dialogues. And it seems to me that this whole question of scale, and if scale is part of this, then so are the processes of legitimation, the growth of the PhD programs to distinguish between the more and less advanced or powerful, and all those mechanisms get in. So I think it's really important that we think about this very large circuit in which, circulation, exhibition, audiences are part of the processes we're looking at. Not just policy and institutional change, but these larger social and cultural changes too.
I think that we don't have time to answer or discuss about these very important topics. Maybe a very, very short statement, no? Okay, well. Okay, so, no, I'm sorry.
It's more important than food.
1 minute.
Okay, I make it very, very short. I was going to ask a question to Roger Malina because I feel the same urgency in contributing to a societal solution on the kind of world we're living in, if we still indeed want to be here in 20, 50 years. And my question was actually a call to a wider collaboration that also takes into account our citizenship. And for further reading, I can just recommend Howard Gardner, The 5 Minds of the Future, and The Ethical Mind. I think we have to stop being self-referential. There's a big crisis, and we need to see how our talents and our knowledge base can contribute to a solution on a larger scale outside of academia.
Okay. I think it's more a statement than a question anyway. So I thank you, all of you. Thank